Well, welcome to class, everybody. It's great to see all of your smiling faces and little boxes across the top of my screen. Today, we're going to start off by just reviewing the work for the week that is due this Wednesday. I copied them to a Word document. The first is discussion number 4 on how ocean currents worked. You know that we discussed ocean currents and learned the workings of both surface currents, which are wind-driven, and we learned about deep thermohaline circulation, which is density-driven. So this TED Talk will refer to our ocean currents, the surface currents. I did have a student email me this weekend, worried because she was the only one posted in the discussion forum, and wanted to know if the problem was on her end or not, because she needed to do her response posts. And I assured her that you guys we'll get to it. Just she was happened to be the first. So just to point that out, the sooner we get a few posts, the better everyone can move on and complete their assignments. So I'd encourage you to post up today for your first post. Thank you. The second is the designing a PowerPoint or Prezi or iMovie, looking at the water masses, our water masses. It's a little more complicated than simply the 3 layers. The water masses include the contribution from Antarctic bottom water, North Atlantic deep water to the deep zone. It also takes into account the contribution of the Mediterranean water. So it's a little more complicated than just the layered ocean. I tried to boil it down a little simpler when we covered it and on test purposes. But when you do your PowerPoint, feel free to add as much detail on those water masses as you can fit in a 10 to 15 slide presentation. Again, I went through the tips for good slide making. So follow those tips as well. A separate APA style reference page is required. Please do not put references on the slides. References tend to make slide presentations a little more mundane. One of the things is to help you get acquainted with making exciting and beautiful presentations for future use, because most of you are probably not going to study ocean water for a career, but most of you probably will have to communicate with a boss or a group of people or an audience throughout your career. So this is something that hopefully you will learn from and be able to use down the road. So those are the 2 assignments that are due this Wednesday. Today's lesson is on waves. And I qualified it as waves and tides, but tides are actually a wave as well. So really, we're looking at waves. And now that guy is surfing an impressive wave. We don't get waves like that here on the East Coast of the United States. And we certainly don't get waves like that on the Gulf Coast. The reason for that is simple physics. Waves break at 1/2 of their wavelength. We're not deep enough for waves that large. You have to have deep water or else the waves break. The tsunami's wave, which would be the largest wave, this is not quite a tsunami, but the tsunami's wave, the wavelength is miles. So you have to have very deep water. The only places tsunamis can do damage is on active tectonic coastlines with nearby trenches or nearby slopes or islands like Hawaii out in the middle of the ocean that are near deep, or the Caribbean, which is near the Puerto Rican Trench. So you have to have very deep water very close to the coast for tsunamis to damage coastline. Here, our Gulf Coast, we're hundreds of miles away from those middle grounds where the water would be deep enough. On the East Coast, it's a little deeper, especially the East Coast of Florida, because the Gulf Stream is carved. It's not really a trench, but it's carved a little path through there. So it's a little bit deeper, closer to shore. So Florida gets, the East Coast of Florida gets larger waves than the West Coast because it's deeper, but we're nowhere near a tectonic boundary like in California or Hawaii or Australia, where the deep is close by. So this would definitely be a West Coast surfer, not an East Coast surfer. On the subject of surfing, because all the time, all my classes, students tend to surf, some of them do, and they look forward to surfing a special type of half wave called the storm surge. And we'll be looking at the storm surge in today's lesson as well. So waves are the transfer of energy. There's no net movement as a wave passes by if it's not breaking. If it's breaking, then there will be a push, but there's no net movement on a deep water wave. It's a circular or orbital motion. And you can see our friend, the ring-billed seagull. The ring-billed seagull is moving up, around, and down, but he or she winds up in the exact same place after the energy disturbance or wave has passed. Speaking of seagulls, the ring-billed seagull there, I usually don't promote classes, but the upcoming semester, I'm going to be teaching an OCB 1000C class, the biology of marine life. And it's a unique post-pandemic class. It's going to meet once a week on Mondays. And the first meeting will be a Zoom meeting, and then the concurrent meetings will be at places like Honeymoon Island or Fort DeSoto. So they'll be in the field. We'll be meeting in partial groups of the class, and then the other parts will be doing labs, and we'll be meeting on a rotational basis doing field work as well. So there'll be hands-on labs, there'll be rotational field work, and all of the lectures on the marine biology are recorded. So there won't be sitting in a classroom, you'll be watching recorded videos and then showing up for field work or doing labs. So it's a unique marine biology class. And I just wanted to run that by you all because first, it would be a pleasure seeing some familiar faces in class. And secondly, it follows in line with the oceanography, except you will get the life science or biology credit, where in this OCE class, you get the physical science credit. So it kind of goes hand in hand for the degree. You also get lab credit because it is a C class. So if you are going for your associate's degree, it's my understanding, and I always say check with a counselor because rules change quick, but you need a physical science, a biological science, and a lab. So the oceanography / marine biology program fits the bill for the degree. So I usually don't promote that, but I've really enjoyed the back and forth with many of you, and the grades are nice. So it'd be a pleasure to see some of you guys in the class next semester if you're so inclined. Now, there goes.
Wait, I'm sorry, can you repeat the name of this class?
OCB.
OCD.
1000C.
1000C.
And its name is the biology of marine life.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Again, it's been a pleasure answering questions for those who've asked them, and the effort that I see here. So, again, it'd be my pleasure to see some of you guys in the regular or semi-regular program. Well, back to waves. There's no net movement as these waves pass. Now, the parts of a wave, the top high point of a wave we call the crest, and the low point is a trough. In this image right here, there are two waves, two complete waves. Here's one wave. Here's the second wave. So a wave, the wavelength would be the distance from this to here, two concurrent points on the same wave. It would be from crest to crest or trough to trough. From here to here would be a wavelength. So half the wavelength is where your wave starts to break. What happens is, the bottom would be sloped. The trough of the wave hits the seafloor. And that slows down the progression of the wave, while behind the wave, it's not slower, it speeds up. So the crest actually catches up to the trough. The wave narrows and swells up a little bit higher, and then topples over as a white cap or a breaker. So waves coming in on a breezy day are consistent heights. So the waves all break in this little zone called the breaker zone, or the breakers. The longer the wavelength, the further out the waves will break, because it'll need deeper water to travel uninterrupted. So the surf zone or the breaker zone, and their synonyms, are at 1/2 of the wavelength. The amplitude of the wave is from the baseline, in this case, still water, the height, or the depth. So you can have a positive or negative amplitude, but it's the height of the wave. Again, the wavelength are two concurrent points anywhere on consecutive waves. The frequency, measured in hertz or cycles per second, is how many waves pass by every second. That would be 1/t, or the reciprocal of time. Meaning the time it takes for one wave is 1/f, or 1 over the frequency. We call that a wave's period, the time it takes for one wave to pass by. Now, ocean aren't the only type of waves. Sounds are waves, light's waves. The frequency of light is color. The amplitude of light is brightness. The frequency of sound is pitch. And the amplitude of sound is volume, how loud it is. So all waves have these properties, and we can use these waves to measure things, measure speed of the wave, height of the wave. But our waves fall into 3 categories. We have a wind-driven wave, and you can see the period of the wind-driven wave is anywhere to about a minute, 1 wave per minute. But usually you get a wave every 30 to 45 seconds. Earthquake waves or tsunamis or storm surges come at a slower rate, here every 5 to 10 minutes. You'll get a wave. That's a lower frequency. You have 2 different tides. You have the 12-hour or 24-hour tidal cycle, and that's a round off. We'll see that when we get to tides. It's really 24 hours and 50 minutes, 12 hours So there's a difference. But those are called tides. And the tidal cycle is 12 hours for a semi-diurnal tidal cycle, or 24 hours for a diurnal tidal cycle. Here you can remember the word semi means part. So a 12-hour semi-diurnal cycle is part of a 24-hour diurnal cycle, just for memorizing which ones are which. Anyway, these are the three things that drive waves on the ocean: wind, storm surge, earthquakes, and the gravity of the sun and the moon. Speed is generally distance over time. That's miles per hour. In the case of a wave, you would have the distance would be a wavelength, and the time would be how long it takes one wave to pass. But more often than not, we use this into, so that's wavelength divided by period. More often than not, though, we go wavelength times frequency, because remember, frequency is the reciprocal of time, or 1/t. Waves can interact with each other, and we call that interference. Sometimes waves interact positively because the crests would line up fully or partially, and the waves would build up and be higher than expected. That wave interaction is called constructive interference. Other times, waves can cancel each other out. That is called destructive interference. Interestingly, some of the, I'm out boater, Tampa Bay area, go by a seawall, and all of a sudden my boat starts shaking up and down really, really high. You go, well, why did it go up really high there? I just passed by a seawall. And what happens is the wave hits the seawall and then bounces back and interferes with the new incoming wave and creates turbulence and builds the waves up in a form of constructive interference. A rogue wave is a wave that occurs from interference that the crest would be much higher than the theoretical maximum. And that would mean several waves, not just two, several waves are interacting, and you get a really high wave in an area that it would not be expected. So that would be a rogue wave. In perfect constructive interference, you can see the wave would just add one wave to the other. It would double. In perfect destructive interference, they would cancel. That's rarely the case, perfect waves lining up. But this just shows you the concept of construction and destruction when it comes to waves. So here you have a point, and because of that, your bottom topography changes. Wherever you have a point, the waves bend toward that point because it gets shallower sooner. And erosion sweeps and forms beaches on the inside of each cove. So this is how beaches form in certain areas, especially if you have rocky conditions and outcrops. We can build, and we do, we build things like the piers or jetties. If you go to Madeira Beach, we have those jetties sticking out. And what that's supposed to do, theoretically, is it helps preserve, stops longshore current, which we talked about last class, and also helps build up the beach. Miami Beach utilizes this as well. Rocky coastlines like on Cape Cod or areas in Maine have these natural rock outcroppings, and also get beaches built up in this manner. So waves bend, refraction means to bend, waves bend toward shallower water and tend to deposit beaches along the sides of this shallower outcrop. Wave diffraction is how they move around obstacles. This is one of the reasons why passes are so choppy. The others is the narrow opening and tides forcing all that water through. What I mean by this, hopefully we're all familiar with Johns Pass because it's close. Johns Pass has terrible current running in and out of it. Some of us may also be familiar with Egmont Key, which is an island and some reef that is located out off of Fort DeSoto. And also Bunce's Pass at Fort DeSoto. Anytime you get these passes, as high tide comes in, all this water is forced through tiny openings. Okay, so you get a lot of current. Also, as waves come in, remember they bend toward that island. Behind the island, you get a lot of chop because those waves are bending around there and then they're interfering. So you're getting a lot of constructive and destructive interference around these islands, around barriers, causing very choppy water. So areas around passes are tricky to navigate in a boat and should never be swum in because of the strong currents and choppiness. That said, Egmont Key, because there's hard bottom reef and a couple of collapsed forts out there, is very prime spot for snorkeling. And many of our local tourist industries have snorkel boats that go out there. And I've done a lot of work out there, and I fished out more than a couple snorkelers who got caught in the current and blew that little vest up and needed rescuing. So I've rescued more than my fair share and had to return them back to like their Tampa Bay charter or whatever, because people get caught in the current and they're just not ready for it and they get swept out. So beware when you're out recreationally on the water for passes and islands in areas that have waves, because you get a lot of chop behind the island and a lot of strong currents coming into and out of passes, these narrow openings in the sea. I also mentioned wave reflection, and we talked about rip currents last class. So here's a big rip current. You can see the rip current coming in there. Waves come in and they bounce off a barrier and move out. And they're mixing with the new incoming waves, causing constructive and destructive interference, making it very choppy and difficult to navigate. So wave reflection also affects waves. So the characteristics of waves are orbitals. Now, I do remember when I was a diver, I was a rescue dive master for many, many years and underwater photographer. So much fun. But we would go out on choppy days and people would be so sick. Once you got in the water and went down a few feet, it was calm. You barely knew it was stormy or choppy. And that's because if you look at it here, you have the orbits and they decrease their energy as you move down the water column until you reach half the wavelength. And at that point, there's no wave interaction with the surface. So obviously the stronger the wave action, the deeper it goes, but you can also see by the image, you know, it doesn't take much and you have half of the energy already dissipated. So
does this change with the way that the waves are made? Like, would this just apply to wind waves, or would earthquake
it applies
waves?
to all waves, but
Okay.
with a tsunami, the wavelength is so big, it's deeper.
Okay.
And with a tide, so it does apply to all waves, but the strength of the wave determines how deep it is. But wave mechanics is the same no matter the source.
All right, thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. So it's very interesting. You jump in and you're down 10 feet and all of a sudden there's no more wave action. Then you come back up and you're getting tossed around like a little buoy. So that's characteristics of wave motion and the interference with depth. Now remember, they are circular orbits. So waves have an orbital motion and they're negligible at half the wavelength. There's no more energy. And that really is the magic number, half the wavelength. So the three causes for waves are wind energy, which is the most common. Tidal waves, ironically, in the 70s, the Poseidon Adventure was a famous disaster movie. People love disaster movies in the 70s. I think in the 80s, it turned to slasher movies and people like Halloween and junk like that. But it was always disaster movies in the 70s. They had Earthquake and the Towering Inferno, and the Poseidon Adventure was about, they called it a tidal wave, but it was really a tsunami. And they had it knocking over a cruise ship. Of course, if the cruise ship was out to sea, that wouldn't happen because it's deep and it would have just been an orbital motion, as you just learned. You can only get the damage done when the wave breaks. So Hollywood took its liberties, but still they called the tsunamis tidal waves back then. And people probably still do that today, but really a tidal wave is caused by the gravity of the moon and then to a lesser degree the sun. Whereas tsunamis are seismic sea waves. They are caused by tectonics or meteorites or turbidity currents, huge underwater avalanches. So we'll start with wind waves, being they're the most common. The strength of the wind is the main determining factor for how high the waves are. How long the wind blows takes a factor. It takes a while for wind to build up. So a short duration wind wouldn't build up the same size waves when you compare it to a long-term wind. And then the fetch is the last factor, and that's the distance the wind has to travel. So a narrow bay does not build up the same size wind as a wide bay. So the wind direction plays a role in the fetch. Place like John's Pass, if the wind is blowing along the shoreline, you don't have a lot of distance for waves to build up in the pass. But if it's blowing from the sea straight in, you have a lot wider fetch and you can build up larger waves. You grab a sheet of paper. And see if I can illustrate that here. Let's just say you have a bay. There's two distinct fetches there. Okay, so our wind direction could give you a short fetch. You would have wave action here, but it would not be as strong as the same speed wind coming in from this direction, because here you have a much larger fetch. So the waves would be much bigger at the same point. So that is the role fetch plays in wave activity. All right. This is the Beaufort scale of wind speed. You can see the hurricane. Everyone knows hurricanes have different categories. Because we live here in Florida, we deal with this all the time. But a Cat 1 hurricane begins at 73 miles per hour or 63 knots. So that's hurricane. Calm sea is like a mirror, and there's still some capillary action due to surface tension. And then you have light air, light breeze, gentle breeze, fresh wind. That's always my favorite, fresh wind. Gale force winds, storm, severe storm. This is the classification. Here's the effects. And then here's the effects on land if we have the same wind. So this is called the Beaufort scale of wind. Just a reminder, a knot stands for nautical mile. It's based on the 1 minute of latitude on the Earth. So a knot is not a statute mile, which we're very familiar with here on land. So here's the Beaufort scale of wind classification. So seas like mirrors would be this, like glass. There's capillary waves because, you know, there would be a little air stress exerted on the surface or surface tension. So the sea or a large lake would never be perfectly flat. There's still little ripples in it. And those are just referred to as capillary waves. That's the best case scenario for boating, fishing. Worst case scenario for surfing or, you know, it's nice for paddle boarding though. You don't want to get beat around on it. A swell is the opposite. A swell is when a wave hits, but it never breaks. Okay, so you have L/2 all the way up to the seawall, and when the wave crashes in, it is not broken, so you get the full wave, and that's called a swell. So here, it's very deep up until this rocky outcrop, and the waves are coming in and crashing without any breaking. Usually you get breakers, but a swell is when the wave doesn't break and it just slams into shore. Waves break at half the wavelength, and you can see you start to get bottom interference where the front slows down and the back doesn't. So the back catches up and topples over that front in what we call the surf zone. So waves slow down, they crowd, and then they break. And this surf zone, usually you carve out a little area. Sand, you know, it rolls through and gets deposited behind it. So behind a surf zone, you usually get a sandbar. Now it's shallow here and the surf zone goes and you get the sandbar kind of creeps out and then disappears and you get a new sandbar. So the sandbars are temporary structures carved out by waves. And they're always moving out a little bit, sinking down, then you get a new sandbar. People love sandbars because they anchor their boats out and they're still a little damp and you can stand on it and it's shallow and your dog can run around. You can play Frisbee and drink lemonade and have a great day out on the sandbar. Whitecaps are just referred to as waves when they break because they get frothy. And so they're called whitecaps. Sometimes they're close to shore, sometimes they're out to shore. So when your waves break, you have three basic types: the spilling or rolling, plunging or dumping, and surging. So the smallest, the spilling or rolling, and these are still pretty decent waves. They're coming in, they're all breaking at the same area. They spill and then they come in. The plunging are much larger waves. You can see these are real surfboards. We don't really get plunging breakers here. We get more of the spilling type that just roll over and then they ebb nice in. The largest are the surging breakers, and they happen on rocky coastlines. Notice there's no sand, it's all been eroded away. So all you have is rocks because the breakers come in so hard. The phenomenon of waves breaking offshore, it's kind of cool. You can stand at Fort DeSoto and you see white sand out a little bit farther. It's called shoaling. And that's because the waves break on that little sandbar that's formed out here, and then they just roll in nice and softly. That's called shoaling. This is the one we get with the storm surge. Okay, storms are low pressure systems. Low pressure is rising air. That rising air holds a dome of water underneath it. Stronger the storm, the greater the storm surge. So you have a tropical storm, you're going to have a storm surge. You have a Cat 1 hurricane, you're going to have a storm surge. You have a Cat 5 hurricane, you're going to have a storm surge. Okay, because the lower the pressure, the greater that pull up and the greater that dome of water is traveling with the storm. That's what storm surge is. When this storm makes landfall, that dome of water being pulled with it makes landfall. So that's what the storm surge is. We've all heard that term. Now, what happens if a storm surge corresponds with high tide? Constructive interference. You get a bigger than expected wave. What happens if it's coupled with low tide? Destructive interference. You get a less than large wave, less than large expected wave. So storm surges pair up with tides to give the flooding possibilities on shore. Now, of course, this is moving and that dome of water is following. So there's ripples falling off that, and those are the waves. There's a lot of wind associated with the low pressure system. So you get a lot of wind waves as well. And that's why surfers around here on the west coast of Florida like storms, because the storm surges bring a dome of water and a lot of waves. So they go out, and that's when they really make hay on the waves and have a good day. A wave confined in a basin is called a setch. And setches are just waves in basins that can be observed in bays. We get them in bays for oceanography. Large lakes get the setch, or reservoirs, deep reservoirs. And that's a standing wave caused by wind in a confined basin. So those are wind waves. The next type of wave we'll look at are the gravity tide waves. This is Mont Saint-Michel in France. 3 years of high school French taught me how to say that with the proper accent. I can't really speak much more French, but I can say that. And this is an extreme example of the tides, because you can see at low tide, it's a peninsula, and at high tide, it's an island. So this is a fairly graphic example of what a tide is. But really, what's a tide? When you look at it, a tide is caused by the moon. Here's the gravitational side. Here's the inertial side. So that's what keeps a planet in orbit: gravity and inertia. A body in motion stays in motion unless acted on by another force. That's inertia. And then the gravity itself. So I'll draw another little image just to show you. here's two bodies. Now, if it were just gravity, G, they would collide. But the moon or the Earth going around the sun, or a natural or unnatural satellite. By natural, Mars has 2 natural satellites. Jupiter has over 60 natural satellites. Earth has a bunch of unnatural satellites like phone satellites and the space station and other things that were put and go around Earth. You have inertia. Inertia is the tendency for it to fly off because it's moving in a direction. Now, if you ever take a physics class, you'll learn that you add forces and vectors, because this is a vector, it has magnitude and direction. You add them up, and they don't add up geographically, they add up directionally as well. So your net direction is here. So when you're here, your net direction would be in here, and you wind up with an elliptical orbit. It's not quite circular, an elliptical orbit. So your satellite is moving around your planet due to gravity and inertia. That is exactly why tides have 2 bulges on them, the gravitational bulge and the inertial bulge. So you have gravity and inertia. So there's 2 high tides and 2 low tides any point on Earth at the same time. That means much of the Earth gets what we call a semi-diurnal tidal cycle. Now, being the Earth is round and the moon isn't in a perfect orbit around Earth's equator, you have areas that get 1 high and 1 low tide. You have other areas that get a combination. So we have 3 different tidal cycles: diurnal, semi-diurnal, and mixed. When you look at it vertically, though, here on these cliff faces, you can see here's your high tide line, there's your low tide line, and different organisms occupy different areas in the tidal zone based on their adaptations. Some can be exposed to air longer, like a barnacle, which can close its little volcano-shaped top. Others need to be covered up most of the time. They'd be lower in the tidal zone. So intertidal areas, areas between the tides, between high and low tides, have different organisms and different sized organisms, because some, like a salt marsh, the grasses grow larger in the low marsh because they get more nutrients from the water, and they're shorter in the high marsh. But so the intertidal zone is the area between the tides, and it's shaped by that ebb and flow of water. So here's a tidal bore. That's a forced wave. It's locked in the gravity of the Earth, the moon, and the sun. So here's the Earth-Moon-Sun relationship that we spoke of before. We have gravity and inertia combining to give us orbital motion. Now, because we are traveling with the moon, the center of gravity of the Earth-Moon system is approximately where my cursor is. Okay, so that center of gravity is not the center of the Earth. It's off center of the Earth, because you have to add the moon's mass to it, because we're going around the sun as a unit, and that causes us to wobble in our orbit around the sun, leading to the precession of the stars and leading to a slightly unstable orbit around our planet. So here's the tidal bulges. The gravity is easy. The gravitational side is just due to basic gravity between the Earth and the moon. Our center of mass is off a little bit, remember? So our backside's a little bit smaller, the inertial side, because it's not, we're a little bit off center, but the combined effect is 2 tidal bulges of approximately the same height on our planet. Again, whoops, there we go. We have the forces balanced here, the bulge toward the moon and the bulge opposite the moon. Caused by gravity and inertia. The tidal period is 24 hours and 50 minutes because the moon rises 50 minutes later each day. So 24 hours and 50 minutes is a tidal day. The reason for that is the moon moves slightly around Earth. So Earth spins once every 24 hours, but the moon's moved. So it takes another 50 minutes to get to where the moon's directly where it was the day prior. That's called a lunar day. A lunar day is 24 hours and 50 minutes, where a solar day is 24 hours. So notice it's not along the equator. It's moving around the Earth. So here you could get 2 highs and 2 lows a day. Here you get 1 high and 1 low every day. It just depends on where you are on Earth as to what tidal frequency you're going to get. So here are our different tidal frequencies. Semi-diurnal, 2 highs and 2 lows each day of approximately the same height. Diurnal, 1 high and 1 low each day. Mixed tide. Generally speaking, for most of the month on a mixed tidal cycle, you get 2 highs and 2 lows, but they break down and give you different heights. And then some days they're irregular. And you'll see that in a moment. We here have mixed tidal cycle, mixed tidal cycle. The apodromic is the pivot point for tides in the center of ocean basins, so there's no tides present. We don't get any of those near shore. That's out toward the basin center. So we'll start off with semi-diurnal. 12 hours, 25 minutes. 2 highs, 2 lows each day. Diurnal, 24 hours, 50 minutes. 1 high, 1 low each day. Mixed tides, combination, but you generally have 2 highs and 2 lows of different heights with some disturbance towards the quarter moons. So here's the map we're looking at. Right here is mixed. Here's 2 days given to you. 1 day you have 1 high, 1 low, 1 high, 1 low of different heights. That's a mixed tide. Notice different heights, different lows. Here's your mean low water mark. Diurnal, 1 high, 1 low in your day. Semi-diurnal, nearly equal heights. Remember, the inertial might be slightly lower, but you have 2 highs and 2 lows every tidal day of equal heights. You can see our area, you get mixed. The West Coast, the West Coast. The Atlantic side, semi-diurnal. You get diurnal in these particular areas, mixed, semi-diurnal. So here's a tidal taken from the St. Pete Times. High, low, high, low. That's a mixed tide, mixed tide. Two highs, two lows, different heights. To further complicate things, the sun plays a role. This image right here is called a spring tide. Your new moon, full moon phases line up with the sun because this half is dark, this half is light. You wouldn't be able to see the moon here. You'd see all of it here. So the sun's gravity works with the moon's gravity, creating large tides. The sun adds to your tide. That's constructive interference. In this image, you're at your quarter moons. You have destructive interference. The small solar tide takes away from the larger lunar tide. So you have lower highs, higher lows, more moderate tides, and those are called neap tides. And they're due to constructive and destructive interference. So on full moons and new moons, you have spring tides higher. Quarter moons, you have lower. So let's say you're moving here. Your tide's decreasing, decreasing, decreasing at a minimum, increasing, increasing, increasing at a maximum, decreasing, decreasing, decreasing minimum, increasing, increasing, increasing maximum. So the height of the tide correlates or corresponds with lunar phase. That's not causation. Causation is not the phase, it's the position of the Earth, Moon, Sun, but it's correlation that you can use the lunar phases to tell how strong the tide's going to be. That's old fishing trick. During full moons and new moons, the fish feed more because the tide is greater. Why is that? Behavior. When the tides are greater, the water current's stronger. Organisms that spawn, and spawning means releasing your eggs and sperm into the water column without intercourse. So you use the water column to mix your gametes. So the stronger the current, the better mixing there is. So organisms that spawn do so on spring tides, which means full moon, new moon. Also, plankton that ride currents are more prevalent riding currents because there's more current, full moon, new moon. Areas like on grass flats that lead to a little deeper area next to it get flushed out on the stronger tides. And that pulls shrimp or little bait fish out into the deeper water or pushes things deeper into the mangroves. So Earth's reproductive cycle, if you will, in the ocean is timed with tides because most organisms use these tides to help move them around. Fish, of course, are feeding because there's more food on tidal cycles. So knowing your lunar cycles, lunar phases, is important if you're fishing or using the tides for recreation, because greater lows could mean you could ground your boat, or better fishing would be more fun if you know your tidal cycles. So again, this is just reiterating your neap tide is during the quarter moon phases. Really, people call it a half moon because you can see half a disk, but it's really a quarter moon because you only see a quarter of the moon. And then during your new moon and full moon phases, you have spring tides, which are high. This image shows it great for you. Okay, let's take a look at this one. Here's a semi-diurnal tide, mixed, different heights. During spring, super high highs, super low lows. During neap, tidal cycle breaks down. You don't even have two highs. Here you have kind of like a broken two highs, one low. So that's what you mean by mixed. It tends to break down during the neap cycles, but you have strong semi-diurnal during the spring. That's your mixed. Here, again, spring tides are high, neap tides are lower, but this would be a diurnal cycle because you only have one high and one low per day. So here's the difference between semi-diurnal and diurnal. Here's your mixed. So your mixed are different heights, and your spring pulses are much larger than your neap pulses, and they correspond with your lunar phases. So this is summarizing all of that tidal information. You can go to the store, say West Marine or any boating store really, and buy tide charts. You can buy them for a whole year, and it's like a little calendar, and you get this data across the whole month with the lunar phases and the highs and lows. You can look in the newspaper and get them for the week. They're very predictable. I mean, there's no real surprises. The only surprise would be a storm surge coming in and changing the height there, but your tides are very predictable. Tides in confined basins, like waves, make a setch. Tides increase the current, but it takes time for that water, so they have a lag time as well. So tides through enclosed basins and passes change their timing. It's not on that 24-hour cycle now because it takes all that time for that water to pour in and then all that time for that water to pour out, but very strong currents. Now, if you live in a tide pool, the temperature of your water here changes greatly. So you have to be adapted to temperature if you live in the intertidal zone. You also, these are limpets, you also have to be able to handle swings in water chemistry. During evaporation, it gets very salty in tide pools. During precipitation, it gets very brackish in salt tide pools. So organisms that live in tide pools have to be able to control their body chemistry as well. Organisms that live in tide pools or in tides, migration and spawning, here's sponges spawning, here's coral spawning, releasing the gametes into the water column and allowing them to mix. Those are done on lunar cycles as well. Nutrients are flushed in and out of salt marshes, mangroves, and tide pools, which are unique habitats caused by tides. So tide pools are the first unique habitats. They are fed during high tide and isolated during low tide. Salt marshes, in our case, our salt marshes are Spartina grass. Salt marshes, the water pushes in, the water flows out. We don't have an extensive salt marsh here in the Tampa Bay area. We have smaller salt marshes. The mangroves basically tangle up and grow in the salt marshes. So we have a lot of trees and mangrove trees and things in our salt marshes. You go up north about an hour and it's too cold for the mangroves to grow, and all you have is extensive salt marsh in the intercoastals and intertidals. So you go up to Jacksonville, for instance, and you'll have huge miles and miles of salt marsh in that area. Here, though, we get the mangroves, mangrove forests or the mangrove swamps, and that mangroves are they're not a group of trees because there's 40 or so species worldwide. And we have 3 main species of mangroves and then 1 associate of a mangrove here in the Tampa Bay area, and they're different genuses. So they're not really related, but they're a group of trees that can monitor their salt balance in different ways. So they can live in salt water or brackish water. None of them have the ability to live where you get a freeze. So all of them are tropical to subtropical species, and they grow in the intertidal zone. They pretty much outcompete salt marshes in our area. That's why we have pockets of salt marsh, but huge mangrove areas. But again, the further north you go, less and less mangroves because they don't tolerate the cold. Case study, corals. Corals mass spawn on tide cycles. Now, many people got their doctorates studying the reproductive cycles of different organisms in the marine environment. So corals are very heavily studied for the reproductive cycle on the lunar cycles and taking advantage of the tides. Crabs, again, no surprise, spawn on tidal cycles. Even this, which isn't spawning, they actually copulate, but the eggs are then fertilized and released and ride the currents to allow the propagation. Fish, again, mass spawning occurs on tidal cycles. There's an extreme example called the grunion, who beach themselves, spawn, and the eggs sit for 2 weeks waiting for the next spring tide, and they hatch on the next spring tide, so the incubation is 2 weeks, and then get carried out on the next spring tide. So this also, every 2 weeks, when it happens, all these dead carcasses litter the beach in the morning, and the birds and beachcombers like raccoons or whatever's living there get a buffet on spring tide. So that summarizes tides, the second type of waves. The third type are the seismic sea waves or tsunamis. Landslides, turbidites, collapse of glacier, volcano, asteroid, earthquake, most common causes of tsunamis. They only cause damage in areas that are deep, and you need to move to higher ground. Their speed is relatively slow in the open ocean, 10 to 20 miles, and their wavelength can be anywhere from 300 feet to 300,000 feet in the ocean. Well, wind-generated wave versus tsunami. But when they approach shore, they can be over 100 feet high. Major tsunamis strike all along the Pacific Rim. Very rarely, notice here, we don't have the East Coast. We have one here with a deep area in Nicaragua, but we're really worried about the Pacific Rim and the Indian Ocean. We do have a tsunami warning system where 26 nations monitor and warn coastal cities of tsunamis. Being tsunamis don't have a huge height or amplitude out to sea, buoys with pressure sensitive areas are linked up to satellites to measure the movement of tsunamis. All right, folks, that wraps up our unit on waves. Are there any questions before I dismiss you as far as waves go? Well then, I'd like to thank you for your time and remind you to get a post done as soon as possible so we can move on to response posts. Have a great day, and I'll see you all on Wednesday. I look forward to it.
Do we know if there's a difference in the effectiveness of evolution due to spawning instead of copulation?
Well, copulation, generally, most organisms that are complex that have less young, so you would have less genetic diversity, but with more parental care, you would have more complex organisms. Whereas spawning, you can rapid fire and colonize a niche a lot quicker, but you would be a lot simpler organism.
All right, so
but it's not a rule of thumb.
Is that to say that kind of like the final end product of any evolution so far is going to be like K-selected and like caring for young?
Again, it's evolution does not work in the way that we think where one's better than the other. It just, some environments are more conducive to one form of reproduction. Other environments are more conducive to another type of reproduction. So plants, for instance, they broadcast spawn, really, when you think of it. How do their seeds get around? By wind, those little puffy things. But if you don't have wind, you can't do it. So you have animals take you around when you stick to their fur. It really just depends on the environment. It's not one's better than the other.
Well, for more complex organisms, though.
Well, again, it's more environmental selection than it is reproduction. How you reproduce, I should say. But when you say an R versus K selection, yeah, you know, more parental care, less offspring, and that tends to yield bigger brained, more quote unquote complex, but much smaller numbers.
All right, thank you.
No problem. Have a great day.
Thanks, you too.
Hey, Professor.
Hey, Jalen.
Hello. For the PowerPoint assignment that's due Wednesday, we just make slides about pycnocline, thermocline, and
Well, you're designing a presentation, so you make it flow. You're going to make proper slides. You're going to present. You're going to give me a separate reference sheet done properly in APA style. It's not just random slides. You're going to put together a program talking about the different layers of the ocean and the water masses.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, I always do start my PowerPoints on Google Slides. Is that okay? Because my PowerPoint.
If I can open it, then it's okay, and if I can't open it, then it's not okay.
Okay.
Okay, I mean, when you turn it in, we'll find out. If I can't access it, then, you know, what am I going to do?
Okay.
So do it the way you do it, but save a copy on regular PowerPoint just in case.
Yes. Okay. Thank you.
All right?
Yes.
Always have a backup plan.
Got it.
Thanks a lot.
Have a good day.
Yep, bye.